Yeah, that's easy. Well, let's get started. How about it? Sound good, folks? Switch this. First, I want to thank Anne, Melanie, Christian, and Steve for joining us today and taking time out of their day. Anne, Melanie, and Steve are going to be panelists along with myself to sort of talk about some of these democratic reforms that we're going to be exploring together. Christian is a student here at CSU, was the student body president last year, and is doing his honors thesis this semester on exploring alternative voting methods. And so it seemed like a perfect opportunity to have Christian sort of moderate the forum and bring in a student voice that way. My name is Sam Houghteling. I serve as the program director for the Straayer Center for Public Service. Get to talk about that in a second on our next slide. At CSU, I really wanted to highlight that we recognize that democratic systems require participation and that results are more representative of our communities when community members are engaged and involved in decision making. At CSU, we believe that our students are both current and future civic leaders, and that the state of Colorado, the country, are well served when students from across the political spectrum choose to engage, listen, and participate in our democracy. So special thanks to the students who are both online and joined us in the room today. Really important that you're here because you're going to be inheriting the systems that are passed off to you. Next slide, please. Really quickly, who are we at the Straayer Center? We were founded in 2017. We equip student leaders with the education, skills, and experience to be successful public servants while connecting with public officials and organizations across the state of Colorado. How do we do that? Next slide, please. In a number of ways. One is through experiential learning. We host the legislative internship, the local government capstone, CSU in DC, as well as a number of other internships. We host events and workshops like community forums like this. We host symposiums, a series called Pizza and Politics, Ask a Diplomat, and more. This was an event actually with municipal leaders from across northern Colorado. So that's mayors, city managers, and others. A number of years ago, we hosted them at the stadium here when it was completed. That was a conversation about what's going well, what's not going well, surprisingly or not surprisingly. The focus of this conversation is around transportation and water. So you get together a bunch of city managers and mayors. Those are the kind of things that we end up talking about. CSU brings really interesting resources and expertise to bear for a lot of these conversations. And we try to bring community leaders, community organizers, et cetera, to the table. And, you know, what's the larger goal here? It's about developing a cross-campus learning community, supporting undergraduate and graduate students through fellows programs, connecting with alumni, working with partnering organizations like the CPD. I see we have some folks from the Center for Public Deliberation here. We're going to be working with them on an event related to ranked choice voting and some of these democratic reforms next week with the Deliberative Journalism Project and the Booter Library System and others. And so I'm going to give them a quick shout out. Next slide, please. So today, we're going to be focusing on alternative voting methods. Of course, ranked choice voting being the method that we're going to be really talking about today, and it's on the ballot. Council compensation, sort of like innovation and reforms related to assemblies. That's what they call it in political science literature. Third parties. We have a third-party candidate for Congress who's actually here with us as one of our panelists to talk about what's it like to be a third-party candidate. And then just general sort of electoral reforms. And the big one here is shifting election day, because that's also on the ballot this year. The city of Fort Collins is proposing shifting election day from the first, let me say that, let me get it right, the first Tuesday in April in odd number years to the first November, first Tuesday in November on odd number years. It's a lot better. Why are these reforms coming at us? We feel like there's been a lot of reforms. I mean, think about mail-at-home ballots. That was a really contentious issue in the 2020 election. We've been doing that here in Colorado since 2014. So that's a reform that actually hit earlier than it did nationally. Why are we talking about this? Well, it really has to do with instability in our political, social, and economic systems. That's usually what leads to reform movements. And today we'll be asking if the interventions being proposed are actually right for the symptoms. I think that's like the key question is, are these interventions actually going to have the impact that we think they are? Are they going to have a different impact? What are we really trying to solve here? What's the big concern? So what are those symptoms? Well, in political science, they talk a lot about heightened gridlock, polarization, and partisanship stemming back to the early 1990s. Survey data also demonstrates that Americans are simply not satisfied with our political parties, our institutions, our politics, or our voting processes. And the share of unaffiliated independent voters plus voters seeking third-party alternatives are at a 20-year high, approaching levels that we last saw during the progressive era. So next slide, bear with me for a moment. I'm going to take off my administrator hat and political science hat. I'm going to put on my US history hat. We're going to talk a little bit about the progressive era from 1890 to 1920. What was that all about? It was about social activism and political reform. So what are the things that came out of that? Think women's suffrage, labor laws, busting monopolies, regulation and transportation of food, land conservation efforts like the formation of the National Park System, Rocky Mountain National Park, banking reform, the establishment of the council manager form of government. That was actually one of these good governance reforms that came out of the progressive area. That's one of the things that we still have here in Fort Collins. And the creation of the referendum system, which is what we call direct democracy, across much of the country. So the ability for us to vote on things like ranked choice voting, council compensation, et cetera, came out of the last sort of wave of reforms that happened 100 years ago. General causes, industrialization, immigration, urbanization, political corruption and realignment, and economic inequality. Kind of sounds similar to the moment we're in right now, a little bit, right? Which is maybe we're going to look at sort of the reform movement and try to understand where it's coming from. This might be a way for us to do that. Really quickly at the local level, the National Municipal League during the progressive era in 1909 actually called for a series of reforms. Things like nonpartisan local ballots, we did that here. Nomination by petition, we did that here. At-large elections, we did that here. It goes on and on. The thing that actually was not adopted very often was ranked choice voting, which was one of their recommendations in 1909. It lasted into the 50s and 60s. Many cities in that era did adopt ranked choice voting during the progressive era. And some of the cities were places like Boulder, New York City, Cincinnati, and Cleveland, and others. But almost all were repealed. And there's a lot of reasons why. We're going to talk a little bit about them today. Unfortunately, this is not a history seminar, so we're not going to go into like too much detail. But in general, historians point to two things. One is confusion. And they're like, this change is a little confusing. The other thing that historians point to is the success of the third parties that emerged, especially the Socialist Party. But along with the Socialist Party, the Prohibitionist Party, the Progressive Party, and the Populist parties. More and more of these parties started to show efficacy and win. And in many ways, that caused a backlash. So next slide, we're going to pivot to Christian, who's going to talk to you all a little bit about the actual ballot measures here in Fort Collins, and then we're going to pivot to a general conversation with us as the panelists. Again, thank you all for joining us, and I really look forward to this. Thanks, Christian. Take it away.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sam. So like Sam mentioned, there are 3 ballot initiatives here in Fort Collins. The first one is the council and mayoral compensation ballot question. Currently, council members receive $10,712 annually, mayor 16,074, mayor pro tem 16,074 as well. If passed, if approved, this would increase their pay to 50% of the area median income for council, 75% for mayor, and 60% for mayor pro tempore. And those exact figures are there: 33.6, 50.4, and then 40.3 across those 3. It would also allow council members, which currently council members don't have an option for health benefits, at least cannot opt into it, into what the staff, city staff are offered. And so that would also open the pathway for council members to opt into the health plan for the city. And this total increase cost annually, as reported by the Colorado, would be $304,000 annually across benefits and then salary compensation increases. The second one that Sam mentioned, shifting elections to November. The central question behind that is around engagement and enthusiasm for the elections, and also voter exhaustion, right? If we were to move to November, it would align with the PSD school board elections, as well as other prominent elections that are happening in the off years. And November, of course, already has that reputation and credential as bringing out more voters. If that were passed, it would go into effect in 2023. And then the third one, of course, that we'll discuss today is ranked choice voting, which would be implemented in 2025 and would change our current system, which is a plurality system, also known as first past the post, also known as winner take all, would change it to ranked choice voting. And with that, we can hop to the next slide. I'll give a brief overview. Thanks to the team at Ranked Choice Voting Fort Collins, the advocacy group. These graphics came from that page. This is a familiar story, right? Where the winner of an election has 40%, whereas 60% of all voters voted for the other candidates, creating the dynamic where there really is no majority winner under the current plurality system. Many states and municipalities have solved for that with runoff elections, and that's essentially what ranked choice voting is an instant runoff election. And we go to the next slide. This is an example of the ballot. Right? Typically, how it works on our ballot now is we select one candidate. Ranked choice voting would be ranking the candidates based on a preference. I'm creating the opportunity for you to select candidates that may not have as likely of a chance of winning, but wouldn't spoil your vote by you voting for them. I wouldn't throw away your vote if you voted for someone who's not as likely to win under the current plurality system. You can jump to the next slide. This is the example I provided. Candidate 1 receives 40%, candidate 2, 35%, candidate 3, 25%. Essentially, how ranked choice voting works is the lowest candidate would be dropped. You can jump to the next slide. Anyone who voted for candidate 3 as their first choice, their second choice would then go into effect. So once the votes are reallocated accordingly, the winner will be candidate 2. The argument being that it allows for the majority of the populace to vote, the majority of the constituency to vote on who their elected officials are. That's a very brief overview. I know there's more depth that we could probably go into. I know we have advocates in the room as well on this topic. And so if you have questions, I'd encourage you to network during this event, after the event. And with that, we can jump to the next slide. Welcoming our panelists for today. We're grateful to be joined by, start with Hutchison on the left here, the CEO of the Chamber of Commerce here in Fort Collins, with over 20 years of experience in the Chamber and the broader business community. And has a number of responsibilities in her role as CEO, including providing management support to the Chamber's committees, the Board of Directors, the Executive Committee, Environmental Committee, and the Local Legislative Affairs Committee. Throughout her tenure with the Chamber, she also managed the Chamber's Leadership Fort Collins and Leadership Northern Colorado programs, and is a Fort Collins native, and received a double major from UNC and Greeley, double major in speech communication and journalism and mass communications. She was recognized in the Biz West 40 under 40 inaugural class and was recognized as a Northern Colorado Business Report Woman of Distinction and the WACE Staff Member of the Year in 2013. And has also received her Certified Association Executive designation from the American Society of Association Executives in 2010. Her priorities can be summarized in 3 words: listening, economy, and advocacy. Hutchison and her sister live in Fort Collins. They're avid supporters of CSU programs, sports, as well as many other educational and community initiatives. So thank you for joining us, Ann.
Thank you, Christian.
And then next we have Melanie Potyondy. Melanie is a CSU and UNC graduate, second UNC grad on the panel. She's a public school psychologist at Rocky Mountain High School, board member for the Colorado Society of School Psychologists, member of the State Mental Health Advisory Committee, and an active representative for the Poudre Education Association. She also contributes to a variety of community political efforts, including being a Democratic precinct organizer and county chairperson for Colorado House District 53, volunteering with the League of Women Voters, regularly participating in progressive campaigns, as well as serving in the interim Fort Collins City Council member capacity in 2021. And that was for District 4, is that right?
Correct.
District 4. Key areas of interest in her advocacy work include attainable housing and employment, environmental sustainability, high quality childcare and education, and behavioral health access. In her free time, Melanie loves playing board games with her family, playing the ukulele and violin, as well as trying out new restaurants and fixing up her home. Thank you for joining us, Melanie.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Then on the right here, we have Steve Yurash, who's lived in Colorado for 19 years after growing up in Palo Alto, California. He holds a physics degree from San Jose State University. He worked in the semiconductor computer chip industry for 38 years, including 23 years at Intel, mostly in design and test engineering. He has served on the Larimer County Board of Health and Fort Collins Electric Board and started working on forming the Colorado Center Party in May of last year. And is now a candidate within the party, as well as the state chairman of the new third party. He's an avid skier, hiker, and motorcycle rider, I hear. He has 3 adult children with degrees in economics, statistics, and chemistry, and 2 grandchildren as well. Thanks for joining us, Steve.
Thanks.
And then you met Sam on the right. Sam Houghteling serves as the director of the Straayer Center for Public Service and Leadership at CSU. Founded in 2017, Straayer Center has the mission to equip student leaders with the education, skills, and experience to be successful public servants with the education skills. Oh, I'm sorry, I said that right. While connecting with communities across the state of Colorado. Prior to working at CSU, Sam worked with the city of Fort Collins as a program coordinator and analyst in sustainability and economic health. He was recently a state of Colorado governor's fellow and has extensive experience working in the community, serving on the leadership teams for the Fort Collins Startup Week, the Northern Colorado Food Cluster, the Downtown Fort Collins Creative District, City of Fort Collins Parks and Recreation Advisory Board, and the American Society for Public Administration. Prior to moving to Colorado, Sam worked as a director for a Massachusetts-based nonprofit, interned at a U.S. congressional office, and received his MPA from the University of Kansas. That's right. His research interests include water policy, collaborative governance, democratic reforms, and much more. And he's currently pursuing a PhD, in addition to all of his other responsibilities, currently pursuing a PhD at CSU in political science.
Thank you.
Appreciate you, Sam. And with that, we'll jump into our discussion, starting with alternative voting methods. Melanie, I know you were part of an election that was kind of the case study for ranked choice voting.
Yeah.
The most recent. Yeah. So I guess first of all, if you could share a little bit about your background in that regard, maybe about that race, and then also why you support ranked choice voting.
Yeah, absolutely. So, to be transparent, I want you all to know that I am a current city council candidate for either this coming April or depending on the how the ballot goes this time next November. And I have been a candidate basically since I lost the District 4 seat back in April of 2021. I am a school psychologist. I work in the public schools. I became involved in politics because I had some opportunities to interface with our local governmental officials and just fell in love with it. I love local government. I love how accessible it is. I love that I could text or call my local folks. And that's kind of how it built steam to me deciding to run for the District 4 seat when it was vacated. Our previous District 4 representative on city council in Fort Collins won a county commissioner seat, which kind of put some dominoes in effect. And I was appointed to the seat. I got to serve for 3 months. I had to run a campaign while I was serving. And as Christian mentioned, mine was one where we had 5 candidates. 4 were progressive. We had 1 conservative candidate, and the vote was split pretty definitively across our progressive candidates who shared some values. And it was about a 70-30 split between progressive and conservative votes. And the individual with the 30% of votes did win the seat. And she's doing a great job. She's an awesome lady. It was wonderful to see 5 strong women running. And it was a kind of a historic race in that respect. But I think, it really illustrated to me that our current first past the post winner takes all system is not a good fit for local government, at least as I see local government. People ask me about politics all the time because I'm the person with all the yard signs in my neighborhood, and they're like, Melanie, what do you think about things at the federal level? And I'll be like, I don't follow that closely. I follow local government because I feel like that's what impacts me the most on the day-to-day. And I also feel like that's where my sphere of influence lies. I can actually have some change. And so I really feel like local government needs to have an open door. And I don't like having a system right now that says that certain people shouldn't run because they might be spoilers, that people, are unqualified. I don't like that if we limit the voting pool that we're going to have fewer voices there, because I feel like every person in this city deserves to see a voice running for their local government that reflects their values, their neighborhood, their community. And, if we get to the point, yes, city council now is nonpartisan, but I can tell you when I was making election calls, the number 1 question I fielded was, are you a D or an R? And I was like, well, we're nonpartisan, but you can look up my voter registration if you want. It's all out there. And I had multiple people say, why isn't your party stepping in and asking somebody to step down? And I don't think that is how it should be. I think it really enriched the conversation to have 5 voices there. I thought that was wonderful. We just don't have a system that sustains that. And I think Sam mentioned that we've had several races over time that we have not had a simple majority. 20% since 1997 of our races in city council, most of which had more than 2 candidates, have been won by somebody who had a minority of votes. And to me, that's not representative government, that's playing a numbers game. So if we really want somebody who is palatable, speaking for the majority of constituents in the area they're going to represent, we need to have a system that allows most people to get somebody that they think speaks for them. So, ranked choice voting is a system that is growing in popularity. We have some test cases that it works. There are concerns out there that there's a lot of data to refute. I think it's a great system for our city. And, you know, I've thought about after my race, I was like, man, I wish that we had primaries or runoffs, but again, it's nonpartisan. With our city growing, however, I feel like we would either need to look at a runoff or look at something like ranked choice voting that allows us to do that without the expense or the additional ballot and attrition. So I'm very much in support. And again, it all comes down to inclusion of candidates and inclusion of voters. And my hope is that we can get more than 40% of people to want to vote in munis if we actually can have some candidates that they see themselves in.
Thank you for sharing, Melanie. I know one of the things that came up, and I think one of the counter arguments that often is raised, as with any electoral reform, right, knowing that trust in public elections is fragile, right, that it's historically has been, especially in the 2020 election, I know it's in conversation, right, the fragility of elections, the importance of trust in elections. I know that's been one of the counter arguments, right, surrounding ranked choice voting. And I'd love to turn to you. Obviously, one of the roles you play as Chamber CEO is offering on behalf of the legislative advisory team, right, a set of recommendations on ballot initiatives at the state level and local level. I know the Chamber chose not to support ranked choice voting and maintain our current system. Would love if you could share your perspective with the group.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Christian. So yes, as the CEO of the Chamber, it's my responsibility to work with our larger membership to analyze local issues and specifically how the impact that they have on business. So there are a number of issues on this very full ballot here in November that we're not taking a position on. Very difficult to show that very specific business connection. This is an issue that we saw as a good government issue. And we opposed this a similar ballot issue a number of years ago and remain in the position of we don't have a broken system. We have people that are willing to put their name on a ballot, do the work, and serve our community. We don't believe that the current system is broken, so therefore we feel a little bit like this is a solution in search of a problem. We observe that cost could be more. Much of that is a wild card depending on will this election occur in November or will it be a standalone election in April? But nonetheless, there are added costs to changing the system. Additionally, complexity is concerning. We did a lot of listening sessions before we took this position to really understand why people vote, why they don't vote, what works with the current system and what doesn't work with the current system. And I was very fascinated by one of the conversations. We had a room of 30 business leaders, and we were talking about things that people liked and didn't like about current elections. Most of the individuals in the room were between the ages of 27 and 40, and I was shocked by how many of them said they hadn't voted in an election until their adulthood because they were worried about making a mistake. That again, as a child that grew up in a household where voting was absolutely a centerpiece of dinner table conversation and something that I have done with pride my entire life. That was surprising to me. So we dug a little bit deeper, and complexity is concerning. We already have, again, recognized business leaders that are running businesses, multi-million-dollar businesses, but they're anxious about marking one dot on a ballot. What happens when we're asking for a complexity in a system that would be harder to understand, especially with our unengaged voters? We think about women, people of different backgrounds, new citizens. Are we creating a system that makes it harder for them to access the system? The last comment I will share is, based on the way that the language is written, there is some anxiety about who has ultimate responsibility for execution of a new way of voting. Right now, and again, this could change, but right now, the language would suggest that the city clerk, who is an employee of city would have a lot of the decision-making power on how deep would the ranking go? How is the analysis done? How full execution? And I believe it's really important for us to have a strong, trustworthy system as we do right now in the city of Fort Collins, in the state of Colorado. And I think citizens should ask themselves if they want some of those decisions being made by a staff member who may or may not have accountability, or by an elected official. So just a few thoughts there.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And one thing to highlight on that, and in transparency, Coloradoan reported that it would be about $38,000 annually per election for the tabulation systems, as well as any related staffing costs. So important to mention that, right? And as informed voters, that you all know that that is a connection to this ballot initiative.
But I will throw in there, Christian, that's simply for execution. That doesn't acknowledge any additional voter education that would need to be a part of the city's budget moving forward. We look at Minneapolis, a sizable financial investment by that government in making sure their citizens understand how the process works. So that 38,000 is simply nuts and bolts, not the add-ons to the Christmas tree.
Yeah, I appreciate you highlighting that. It's not a novel idea. We'll have questions at about 5:15.
Oh, it's kind of pertinent to this stuff.
Is that we'll keep the dialogue going, but feel free, like if you have.
What's the city budget, Sam?
Off the top,
Yeah,
Half a
700
billion.
700
Half a
million.
billion.
Yeah, it would be.
$500 million by the time you take out all the intercity transfers.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say, 700 million when you include all the transfers and the enterprise funds and stuff
you
like
happen to
that.
know how much they spent on elections?
350,000.
I hear it's 350,000 for the audience. Just kidding. Yeah, question.
And with that, one thing, Sam, we'll turn to you next. Jack Santucci is a scholar on the topic, Devin McCarthy as well. They collected data that suggests that satisfaction with democracy is inversely related with support for electoral reforms. In other words, the less satisfied someone is with democracy, the more likely they are to support electoral reforms, which is not a novel idea by any means. It also bears out that generationally there's a divide. Younger people are more excited and enthusiastic around election reforms. I've even experienced that anecdotally. The vast majority of young people that I talk to about RCD and other similar election reforms are eager, are excited, are interested in innovating our system in the interest of democracy. I guess my question for you, Sam, is what story is the data telling us, and how that relates to what I genuinely believe is our shared objective to improve our democracy, to improve engagement and overall enthusiasm for our system.
Appreciate it. And before I go into that, just for full disclosure too, so I am the director of the Straayer Center. I'm also a citizen of the city of Fort Collins. And so as a citizen, I've actually endorsed ranked choice voting and another one of the ballot measures. And the other ballot measure that I endorsed is council compensation pay. I can get into why personally I endorse those. What's been really exciting over the last few months for Christian and I is like we've been able to go down this journey, this research journey about what does the academic literature tell us? And the academic literature is not sort of like values based saying we think we should do this or this. It's okay, what's actually happened? What are the ways that we can evaluate it? Do we have enough data to evaluate it? And that's one of the challenges with ranked choice voting right now is that there's something like I think it's a little over 50 cities, counties, and states that currently have ranked choice voting in place. A ton of those have just authorized it in like literally in 2022, many of them in 2020. So big, broad sort of brushstrokes in terms of does this work or does this not work from an academic perspective. It's hard for us to find that information, but there is a ton of just general information, excuse me, historical information about systems and institutions and that kind of stuff. And that's really what Christian and I have sort of been pulling off of. So Jack Santucci has worked with a bunch of other academics. He's a professor at Drexel. He's like one of the guys nationally who's looking into this. And they were trying to figure out what are the biggest like qualifiers, like differentiators between whether or not somebody supports ranked choice voting or not. And the number one factor or the number one sort of determination is age. And so young voters across the board support things like ranked choice voting much more than older voters. The number two differentiator was actually partisanship. If you tend to be unaffiliated, progressive, or Democrat, you support ranked choice voting. If you're Republican or conservative, all of a sudden fewer and fewer people support ranked choice voting. And so in general, like, I think we need to ask, why are younger people so supportive? What's the story here? And it's pretty obvious. Here's what the data is demonstrating to us. Younger Americans are more liberal than any other generation, but also less partisan than any other generation. So they don't feel comfortable in the Democratic Party, generally younger voters, but usually, they have sort of more liberal sort of values. So that means they tend to be unaffiliated. They have really low trust in institutions, and they're really skeptical about the state of democracy, in addition to having the lowest economic mobility of any age demographic. And so when you factor all of those in, that's sort of this story that Christian and I started to find from the literature, which is younger voters are specifically trying to find ways to change, improve, rework sort of our democratic systems, and they're trying to do so through the systems. At the largest level, if you think about sort of the reform movement in general as well, like one of the things that Christian and I were we struggled with was there's a concern in the academic literature, which is, okay, so we're thinking that this was going to work potentially to, improve sort of where we are at related to polarization, potentially lower partisan gridlock. There's a few other things like that. But generally speaking, because elections are administered at the local level, so cities and counties, it's at the city level where we're seeing reforms, and cities tend to be nonpartisan. So the question is, wait, if the local election is already nonpartisan, is this going to have the impact that we think it will have? In New York, they asked the very specific question about cost, number of candidates, turnout, and civility. And what they found in New York was that turnout and number of candidates and civility all sort of improved a little bit, but cost, there was a lot more cost associated with ranked choice voting than they expected, primarily because New York has public funding of elections. So if there's more candidates, the election is going to cost more. And in general seats where they were usually seeing 2 to 3 candidates in New York, they saw 5 to 7. So that's going to increase costs a lot. But that's the generational story is, I think, a really important one. And I think it, for Christian and I, it sort of reaffirmed some of the things that we knew from speaking to members of the student body and the CSU community about interests related to ranked choice voting. Thanks.
Appreciate you sharing, Sam. And with that, Steve, I'd love to turn it over to you. Any thoughts on ranked choice voting, and then we'll dive into the discussion on third party.
Right. So being a member of a third party, I absolutely support ranked choice voting. So particularly at the municipal level, because you've got the possibility of so many candidates. Publicly funding these candidates is probably not a good idea, but I do support a blue book for the city to compile statements from each of the candidates so that every voter can see what the candidate's statement is. And I think if you're doing that, then you also have an opportunity to educate the voters about how ranked choice voting works. So I think those costs sort of fit together. I was actually a candidate for city council, and I dropped out because I was going to split the vote with someone. I had raised $6,000 for my campaign. The other candidate on my side raised a little bit more. And so I decided, it was a gentleman's agreement that we had between us, that whoever did not raise as much money would drop out. And so I did. And so I was affected by the fact that of the current existing election method, and if we'd had ranked choice voting, I might have been able to stay in. So so a little bit different beyond the municipal side, but in state and national elections, ranked choice voting would be a little different. And the outcomes are going to be different because you have still have primaries. I was interviewed by Ross Kaminsky on KOA, and he said, well, 60% of the voters in Alaska voted for a Republican and yet no Republican won, the Democrat won. Well, it depends. That's bad statistics, right? Because if the Democrat is ranked higher, then the Democrat's gonna win. It's not about how many voters put a Republican somewhere on their ballot. It depends on where they're ranked. And so my answer, to Ross was that it had that election in Alaska had the outcome that was properly determined by the voters. That's what they wanted. They didn't want Sarah Palin or somebody who was too extreme. And I think if we do get ranked choice voting, particularly at above the municipal level, we will end up getting more moderate candidates. And I think that would actually result in more stability in our government system, right? So that you don't have a state go like Virginia going from complete Democrat control to now complete Republican control. You're going to have these wild swings back and forth. Whereas if you had ranked choice voting, I think you'd have the opportunity for a more stable government because there would be some people in the middle, not necessarily a majority, but enough to calm things down. And I think it would increase civility in our political system.
I'll quickly offer a definition, but one of the things that Steve mentioned is when the person who after the first round has the most number of votes, but doesn't end up winning. And that's in the political science world, that's called vote leakage. And an example actually is the New York City election. Eric Adams, who is the current mayor, was not in first place after that first round. In fact, I don't think it was until the third round that he took first place. He was one of the most moderate of all candidates. And so it demonstrates exactly what Steve's talking. The larger the pool and the more rounds that go, that vote leakage oftentimes means that more moderate candidates emerge.
And Sam, just to point out those statistics, and I'll look to Robbie, it's only 4% of the time that the person who was in the lead in the first round does not end up winning with subsequent rounds. So I just don't want people to think that happens half of the time, as it's a person who comes from behind. It's 4%.
Well, and if my colleague Kyle Saunders, who's a political scientist at CSU, was here, he would say, well, is that justification for does the system need to change? He would use that statistic.
Yes.
Or put another way, he would say, is ranked choice voting going to have an impact on winners at the local level? And even if it doesn't have an impact on winners, does it still have an impact on the election? And that's where the turnout, the civility, the number of candidates comes in. So even if only 4% of the time it impacts the winner, it actually can still have structural impacts on the election itself. All interesting stuff. In my mind, elections are marketplaces for ideas.
Yes.
And when it's very infrequent in our lives do we only have two choices. And so even in a local election, you might have more choices, but then that's where the circular effect comes in. So if we want to have a marketplace for more ideas in our politics and our systems, then we need to rethink sort of the systems that we use to elect people, because right now it's really sort of two-party politics. And that's Martine, I don't want to butcher one of your quotes, but we look at communications professors and other professors have looked at sort of our actual electoral system and said, is it actually going to lead to good governance? And right now, sort of the thought process is, if we were to develop one of the worst systems for electing people, we would develop the system that we have, the two-party system with the Electoral College in the United States. It's really complex, and it essentially sort of prevents a lot of people from feeling like they have a voice and they don't participate. We have some of the lowest turnout at the presidential election, provincial, state elections, and local elections than many of other industrialized democracies. And so that's a question I want to ask. Is if our election turnout is really that low compared to other folks, why wouldn't we want to find ways to increase that? And maybe ranked choice voting is a way to do that. Maybe there are other ways to do that. But in general, that should be a goal, right? Is getting more people involved in the democratic process. Because the more people who are involved in the democratic process, my view, which is I'm biased, but my view is you get better results. And so if we're all viewing this through the lens of good governance, then I think that's a good starting point.
So if I could follow up on the civility conversation, Sam, completely agree that civility is incredibly important at all levels. Sadly, we're not seeing that at the state or the federal level, but hopefully we're doing things better locally. And I actually had a conversation with Kent Theory on Friday, and Kent is one of the statewide leaders that actually helped to put ranked choice voting through the state legislature and make it available for local municipalities to consider adoption. And I shared with Kent my observation that when money is put into the hands of candidates at the local level, civility is incredibly high. I can't tell you how many candidate conversations the chamber has hosted with all the candidates sitting at a table, and many of the ideas being very similar across the table, and the presentation and the conversation being incredibly civil. I would observe our bigger problem is that we're not putting the money into the hands of the candidates. We're putting the money into the hands of outside parties that are potentially changing that civil conversation. So he and I had a, like I said, a very interesting conversation about what really is broken in Fort Collins, if there is anything broken in Fort Collins.
Well, I think that's a good point, and that there are other election reform issues worth looking at.
Yes.
But I would say, I would agree. My race, I experienced an incredible level of civility. I do know there were races that were less civil. I guess my biggest thing, though, with regard to things being broken is I don't think 40% turnout is a system that's working for voters. And, if it's something that's working for voters, I would hope, especially since in our city, we're fortunate to have our ballot sitting on our kitchen counter, waiting for us to fill it out, that we would be getting more. And to me, that is a broken system. Whether RCV is the panacea, I don't know, but I really would hope that if we have a wider swath of candidates, that people might get excited and vote for their first time. And that leads to a snowball of, more involvement. So that's where I see the brokenness, is the 40% turnout.
Great news is we are aligned. Absolutely would love to see more people use their voice and show up in elections. There's no doubt about it. So you and I can work on that.
And when you say outside money, do you mean like 527 stuff?
527s, independent expenditures. And this, my observation is in the state of Colorado, some of that is spiraling out of control. And we're seeing it every day on TV right now. How many of the commercials that you are seeing right now are actually from that candidate sharing their perspective? And how many are someone else painting the picture of that candidate or the issue? Same thing.
I'd like to point out that if you only have two candidates in the race, then a negative campaign ad will absolutely benefit one side. If you have three candidates in the race, a negative campaign ad, you don't know which of the other two that will benefit.
Sure.
Which is great.
And if I could turn,
Yes.
amazing discussion, if I could turn to Steve on that note, I know what you all were discussing, this idea of those who are courageous enough to challenge the establishment, right, and be that, and be that voice. Steve, we'd love to get your take. Can you share more about your perspective of being a third party candidate, the lessons that you've learned, and what insights you've gleaned throughout that process?
So, yeah, it's been a real interesting journey for sure. I started working on the center party last May. I wrote the website, I wrote the bylaws, I filed all of the forms with the election committees and the IRS. I sent out 35,000 postcards, mostly around suburban areas on the Front Range. So I got the voter list, and I used my computer skills to filter the voter list to decide who I was going to mail to. Did that all on my own, but I was able to recruit people to start the organization. The response rate was very low, but it was enough to get officers and bonus members into the executive committee who are very committed. Yeah, well, organizing it has been a lot of work. Just because somebody, there are a lot of people out there that have said, oh, this is great. We really need something in the middle. I've been waiting for this kind of party to appear. No, I'm sorry, I can't volunteer. Right, so people, particularly getting signatures, a lot of people would say something like that. That they think it's a great idea, yeah, I'll sign, but can't volunteer. But at least I had the core group of people already. It's also been very difficult to get money. So I basically self-funded everything. Jack Graham has generously, he and Ginger have donated $5,000 to the party. So that's been really good. I also talked to Kent Theory's chief of staff, not Kent directly, but if somebody like that took a bigger interest in the party, things would take off. But the thing is that so I submitted 2,164 raw signatures to the Secretary of State. The minimum I needed valid was 1,500. And the Secretary of State said that 1,537 were valid.
Well done.
I didn't get much sleep for it. I started doing my own validation and I wasn't sure what was going to happen. But so it's very, very difficult for an independent candidate to get on the ballot, right? As Drew knows. You have to get the signatures and it's like, well, you're an independent candidate. I don't know anything about you. Why should I help you? Right. So having the party was very critical, right? This little picture I would have on the back of my clipboard and people will look at that and go, yeah, okay, you're in the middle. Where do I sign? Right. So having the party was very important. It gives people an understanding that you're not off by yourself, that there's other people that are part of this effort. So that's a very big lesson. And again, there have been a lot of people who want to take my money because they can help me with the website and the search engine optimization, and I'll rewrite the thing for you and I'll do this and that. It's like, or the trying to buy the voter list. It's like, no, I think I can do that myself, and then also the petitioning, we engaged with 2 different firms and one of them was lying to my face every day. But, and one of our candidates said, okay, I'm done. This guy is just lying to us. I'm done. Give me my money back. Because we had to front this guy money. And I said, no, it's okay. You're not telling me the truth, but you say you're going to give me some signatures. Please get me some. He ended up getting me 146 signatures. And for sure, that was part of the margin of victory. And the other guy, again, I gave him more money than he needed. He still hasn't refunded my $1,000 yet. He keeps telling me some sob story about how he doesn't have enough money. And so, and we placed an ad on Craigslist. I found a guy who wanted to get paid for his summer job to collect signatures down in Boulder. He got over 600 signatures for me. And that was basically his only job in the summer. And so that was key as well. So, without some of the, and one of the paid firms, the guy didn't give me all his money back, all my money back. He got me 350 signatures. And yet that was sort of happenstance. He's very well connected with Scott Lamb. And so Dick Lamb's son, former governor. And Scott's real busy, but he likes the center party idea. If he ever, and he's very involved politically. So, he might do something with the party at some point as well. So, so third parties, I think the group might find this interesting. So I have had some conversations with the Forward Party. And so Andrew Yang ran for president in the Democrat primaries not too long ago. And so he's now forming the Forward Party. Well, the Forward Party actually recently merged with the RAM and the SAM groups. So RAM is Renew America Movement. SAM is Serve America movement. So joinsam.org is one of the, well, again, that website's going away because they've all merged with Forward. It's all under the Forward Party. So they've got money, right? They call their big donors assets. Well, we have a certain asset that it's going to be named the Forward Party. We're not changing the name, you know. It's like, okay, I get it. Andrew is putting up the money and he wants to use the Forward Party name. So, but like Join Sam is also more of an IEC. And there was a big donor in Aspen, actually, that was funding way more than half. I don't know, maybe about 70% of the money for that. But David Jolly, former Republican congressman, was part of the group. He voted against Trump, so you know he doesn't have his seat anymore. But he was part of that movement. Christine Whitman was also, I think she was actually part of the Graham movement. So it's very interesting that this kind of formation has some money. They have some operatives, you know, I can't call them volunteers because they're getting paid, right? But they're organizers. And but they're coming from this very disparate view. We've got Forward Party people, which are more progressive. Andrew Yang was supporting universal basic income, UBI, and they're dropping that because they realize that's baggage they can't deal with. I apologize if this is going wrong, but so stop me if I need to. But whereas the RAM and the SAM groups are a little more right of center, and so it's they explained to me and to the other groups, right, that of people that are helping that they still have a very interesting positive chemistry between the different people that are helping to organize this, because they know it's so important for America to get this done. So I don't think they're going to be supporting me, but I'm actually way further along in the process of creating the third party, because we're already a qualified political organization. Having me get on the ballot successfully, it was stage one, the qualified political organization. Of course, I had to have all the other stuff, the bylaws, the organization, and all that done first in order to be able to have the petitions to get me on the ballot, say, as a candidate for the Colorado Center Party. So my name on the ballot will say, you know, Center Party. So there are other efforts at third parties, although the Center Party in Colorado is way further on, and that's I think the crux of what something like the Forward Party is going to go through in their difficulty, as well as the Common Sense Party in California. Former Congressman Tom Campbell, who I have met before since I grew up in his district in the Bay Area, is trying to form the Common Sense Party. They have to get 60,000 signatures, and it just completely fell apart because of COVID. And so he's in discussions with the Forward Party as well, to see, you know, what they can do. So we're fortunate in Colorado that the barriers are not impossible to start a third party. It's actually fairly reasonable. It was hard getting on the ballot, and so that I think is a barrier that actually makes some sense, even though there were I think, well, there were 11 RTD candidates, the Regional Transportation District down in Denver, that were independent. Only one of them made on the ballot. They only needed 250 signatures. And there were 4 other candidates, 2 state senate, 2 house, that were independent that did not get, Drew being one of them, that submitted signatures that did not get on the ballot. So, and there was one of our other candidates for Congress, he submitted 1,500 signatures. No, I'm sorry, it was more like 1,700. It was more than the minimum, but there were too many rejected. People signed, they don't know if they're actually registered to vote or not. The signature is a scrawl, you know, there's all kinds of issues where signatures or the names get invalidated. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens next. So I need 5% of the vote in the second congressional district race to become advance the center party to minor party status. Right now, we're qualified political organization. A new voter or voter who moves and has to re-register to vote can affiliate with the center party. So if we get 1,000 people to do that, affiliate with our party, we become a minor party. Or if I get 5% of the vote, we become a minor party. And what that means is that people who want to run for office as an independent, it's like, oh, center party looks interesting. They can go through our nominating process and they will not have to petition on a ballot. Because that is a pretty huge barrier. If you've got, if your group of people who are supporting you is too small, then you'll never be able to, get through the petition process. Whereas if you join the party, now we can attract all these other candidates because it'll be much easier for them to get on the ballot to November. So, we'll see. Would a center party candidate get more than a Republican in a Democrat nominated district, or vice versa? Would a center party candidate get more than the Democrat in a Republican dominated district, right? And so there are races in the state where a Republican or a Democrat doesn't even appear on the ballot because it's so dominated by the other party. So that would be an area where the center party could really take off. And the Unite America analysis definitely shows how that would work. And there was a case study from 2018. So because the number of independent candidates who actually serve in Washington, DC or in a state legislature is so small right now, right? So the gap between Republicans and Democrats has never been bigger. I mean, even when you talk about the progressive era, government wasn't doing as much. Government wasn't as powerful at the time.
Before the New Deal.
Before the New Deal, right? They needed to increase the power to decrease the power of businesses. But so many of the people in government were all about business or the corruption or whatever. So so you didn't have the polarization between the two parties that you do today. The two parties are so far apart in their vision of the future that really a third party in the middle has a much better chance.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for sharing it. Just incredible nuance and insights there, and hopefully valuable for the audience to hear.
Sorry, everyone.
Oh no, it's very, very insightful. I think related to that theme, obviously, financial barriers kept coming up right throughout that story.
Yes.
Right. All of these, and maybe I guess turning the page to council pay as a point of discussion. Not only in running for office, but once you've been elected to office, right? The high opportunity cost of serving on council, of serving in the mayor role, of serving our city, right? Knowing that opportunity cost will often prevent younger candidates with families, candidates who are working hourly jobs, renters in our community, right? From being able to pursue elected office. Melanie, I know you mentioned, obviously, your role in the interim council role, 8 boards and commissions that you were liaison to, constituent emails, council meetings, the infamous 400-page packet that they have to read before Tuesday nights, and all of the other investments that it takes from time perspective. Can you share your thoughts on council pay and if you're in support, why?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I want to compliment you. That was a masterful segue. Yeah, and don't quote me on the 8 boards and commissions, but I was kind of describing to Christian the demands of city council. And I think some folks believe, and even a candidate in my election cycle had said, well, it's just a Tuesday night meeting. It's a 6 to 7 hour Tuesday night meeting, sometimes in addition to preparing for the meeting, serving as a liaison to multiple boards and commissions, meeting with constituents, meeting with city staff to understand the issues. And they did a little a poll of the current council members and previous council members and mayors to see how much of a time commitment is this. And currently city councilors are saying about 20 hours a week, and that was definitely my experience. I only had 3 months, but it's a rigorous schedule, and the mayor and mayor pro tem have even more demands on their time. And so right now they're making about $8 an hour for the time that they're putting in, if those are accurate numbers. And I think we would all agree that we want highly qualified people making really important decisions for our city. You're not going to get highly qualified people who want to do the work for $8 an hour. I would say it's kind of akin to the thing with affordable housing. I think Fort Collins used to be so desirable that people would make it work with our housing costs. Now we've reached the tipping point where you can't make it work. And I think council has been the same way. We were a city that was of a size where people cared so much about the city that they would make it work for the $8 an hour. But we're a really large city now, and the amount of time and the commitment and the skills that are necessary is really undercompensated with what they're receiving. And like Christian pointed out, right now we have the most diverse council, I would say, since I moved to Fort Collins, as far as jobs and gender and sorts of things. But it's still a system that's pretty much built for people who are retired, who have a spouse who can support them in doing the job, or who have a super flexible work schedule. And I can tell you, being a public educator, I did not have the flexibility to leave for a meeting at 9 a.m. And I also didn't have the flexibility to quit my job as a public school psychologist to be a city councilor. And, I'm somebody with a professional job. So I think about, if we want to get folks who are working in a wider variety of experiences and professional backgrounds in our city, we have to make it something that will displace time that they are at their workplace. And so that's why I think it's really important. If we really believe that we want to have a representative government, we have to allow people to take the time to do it well and compensate them appropriately. And the health insurance is critical. So many people in our current governmental system or our current healthcare system, they have to work and get health insurance through their employer. And so that's a barrier. And if we are giving health insurance through the city, we have folks who might be open to running who never would have been able to previously because of their health insurance situation. So I think it's really critical. And I hope that people understand what city council does and how important it is.
Well, let's go to that fact. If you were to win, the pay didn't pass, would you not take your seat?
I'll say that one more time. Oh, if the pay didn't pass.
But you won your election.
Well, I put in my name to run far before council pay came up.
Okay.
So I mean, what I would say is what it would allow me to do would be probably to be a school psychologist 3 days a week and devote 2 days a week to council, which would be incredibly helpful. I would still run. It would just be, I think, what many working folks on council have experienced is you're running around like a maniac, but you do it because you love it. But it would be really nice to be able to run more slowly and be able to still make it work financially.
And of note, Melanie does have to make that choice because she's not actually on the November ballot.
Exactly.
She's a candidate for our next municipal election, which will either be April or November. And we'll have a decision on council compensation November 9th.
There are a lot of things up in the air.
Yes.
That was the question.
Yeah.
And on that note, Anna, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And maybe I know the chamber was neutral on
Yes.
on moving elections from April to November.
Yeah.
I would genuinely believe that all of us want to see more voter turnout.
Yes.
I'm curious your thoughts on moving in November. Excited about it, against it. It sounds like neutral, right?
I'll share two observations. The first is, as an organization, we actually also did not take a position on council compensation. We are encouraging our members to do their own homework and to make that choice on their own. I will observe that we had council compensation on the ballot as little as 4 years ago, and it failed. And at that time, every candidate running for office except the candidate who actually petitioned the item onto the ballot said that they would not take council compensation if it were to pass. So it is, again, just an interesting observation of how short history is and how quickly ideals can change. Nonetheless, we've chosen not to take a position, and we encourage people to do their own homework. On moving the election date for municipal elections from April to November, again, as an organization, we did not take a position on that. My observations would be, there's a lot of noise in November, and we're certainly seeing it right now. We saw it last November. Every November is highly highly politically charged season. And personally, I do get anxious if we were to move our municipal elections to November. Are we creating barriers for the candidates that we say we want to raise their hand and consider running for office relative to cost of elections? Certainly media works the same in November as it does the rest of the year. If there's high demand, there's a higher price. There's lower demand, there's a lower price. So are we creating barriers that are harder for disenfranchised citizens to raise their hand and go through the process to be able to access the system? So again, that doesn't sway our position as far as pro or con. It's simply an observation and something that I hope people will consider as they look at the issue.
I just wanted to respond to Ann, and this is actually a question because I remember following the council pay saga over the last few years. I do believe the previous previous proposal was significantly more pay than the one that is currently on.
It was full area median
Nice.
income.
Which would
Which
be
at the
about
time-
65,000.
Yeah, I think at the time it was like 65 or 57. I remember
was
67 coming up a bunch of times. And you know, I think to Ann's point about that story, optics, it shows how optics really matter. To have the person who is leading the effort also running for council, it sort of muddied the ability for people to look at it in a lot of ways. At the same time, it still got like 42% of the vote. And it was certainly unpopular. So if it's getting 42% of the vote, it's not that popular. Fast forward 4 years later to what we're talking about now, I think that there's just this general observation. Kristen Stevens told this story about 5 years ago when she was on the council. She was a single parent at the time. She was talking about if she needed to pay a babysitter using her stipend to be a city council member, would she have enough money to pay the babysitter for all the time she was supposed to be at council? And if I remember correctly, she was like, what she found was that it didn't even cover the babysitter. So if we essentially are compensating at a level where single parents, low to moderate income Americans are essentially looking at this as an opportunity to say, I'd love to serve my community, but 25 hours a week with that level of compensation, I need to put dinner on the table for my family. And so we want to get it beyond that being a decision-making a factor in decision-making for citizens of Fort Collins. If you look back historically at who served at the local level, it's oftentimes those with means who are retired. And so by offering compensation, we're trying to change the dynamic of who's in a representative position. And it really gets to sort of two core points of political science. Are institutions representative of folks? Are institutions responsive to folks? And generally speaking, across the board, our local institutions are actually the most responsive by far. But in general, the lit in political science is kind of sad, actually, because in the last 50 years, it shows that our systems of government are not necessarily as representative or responsive to our needs as citizens. They are very responsive to moneyed interests. So I could go into depth there. There's a lot.
Which is why I love this conversation, Sam, because certainly election reforms and what's the problem we're trying to solve, I think also relates down to service reforms. Melanie experienced 20+ hours a week in service. We're a city manager, council form of government. Should the work level be at the level of 20 hours a week for a council that is actually hiring professional staff to manage the city? Interesting conversation as well.
The mayor probably works 50 to 60 hours.
So we've covered a lot of ground. In a few minutes, we'll transition to questions. So if you have questions, start thinking over them. If it's all right, I'd love to do maybe one more pass through it. Each of you quickly elevator pitch. What should the voters think about as they're approaching their ballot at the dining room table, next to the fireplace, wherever they're choosing to fill it out? And do you want to kick it off? Quick ballot.
Certainly. I certainly want to encourage every single one of you to use your power of the ballot. Make sure you fill out that ballot and turn it in. As noted, Colorado has had tremendous advancement in making it easy for you to vote as a citizen. My one observation, and this isn't happening at the local level, but do a smidge of homework. Don't necessarily take a TV ad or a radio ad or an online ad as the full story. I encourage you to do just a little bit of homework to really understand what the ballot issue is asking you as a voter. And there's lots of resources available to you as voters. Certainly the chamber has some, but Common Sense Institute does, the Democratic Party. Lots of people want to help you understand what's on the ballot. I invite you to do just that little deeper dive, because what you see on a commercial may or may not be the full story.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on what Ann said, obviously like I said, we have our ballots on our kitchen counter. So not turning it in is just stifling your voice. And I just wanted to throw out a resource to folks. If you are looking for kind of a one-stop shop for nonpartisan information, the League of Women Voters has a website called Vote 411. It has every candidate who's turned in a questionnaire and all of their values. And then it does have just a pro-con that's much more user-friendly than the Blue Book for all of the ballot initiatives. So the league is nonpartisan. I think it's really important. And I've used that source a lot. But I just would say in general, when you're voting, and the reason that I am voting yes on all of or I will be voting yes on all of these ballot initiatives is Fort Collins is a leader, Colorado is a leader, and I think we need to be a leader in inviting people into the political process, inviting voters in, helping people see voters that are candidates that are representative of them. Anything that can make voting easier and more accessible and more enticing to people that is legal, obviously, we need to pursue, in my opinion. We are a democracy and we have 40% of people in the city exercising their right to the democratic process. So vote, do your research. But I do think that these are some this is a time where the iron is hot and we should strike for some opportunities to improve our voting system here to make it more inclusive and equitable and accessible.
Thank you, Melanie. Steve?
Well, I don't know. Doing the third party, it's going to be really interesting to see if people get over their fear of letting the other side that they don't like win. And I think that's really what motivates a lot of people in voting. It's like, oh my God, I can't fathom what's going to happen to our country if the bad person wins. And having that mindset switch to more of being able to vote for what you really want in your elected official, I think would be a good step forward for our democracy. But we certainly aren't getting that with all the ads on TV. As far as the municipal elections go, well, so I served on the Larimer County Board of Health and also the city board of the electric board at the time. It's now an energy board, and I was not on it at that time. There was something that scared me while I was on the Board of Health, and that when we started hiring the new person, I left right before we voted for Tom Gonzalez. He was definitely the best of the three finalist candidates. But we ended up meeting with people were employees of the health department, and they came to me and said, there is someone in management who is very abusive and is retired on the job, and can you help us get rid of this person? And that was really scary. I did get involved. Staff didn't want me to get involved, obviously, because that was going to besmirch Adrienne LaBailey's reputation, because she was responsible for this person. And so I was glad that I was able to make a difference in making sure this person left. But that definitely was very eye-opening. I had been on the board for many years and had no idea this was going on. And so understanding that city government, any level of government, has really good things it can do, but really problematic items as well, where there's dysfunction. not just in Congress where you see the party line votes all the time, but actually in what the government is doing is a real problem, I think, in America today. We had the bill that passed that was called the Inflation Reduction Act. Did it have anything to do with reducing inflation? No. Are some of the items in that good and that we need? Yeah, maybe some of them are. But there is a lot of change that we need in government today at many different levels. And so I'm hopeful that some of these reforms will eventually help get that done.
That was a New York City elevator pitch right there. It's 100
Sorry.
Sam, you want to bring us home and then we'll jump into some questions?
Yeah, here, I'm gonna try to jump around really quickly with a couple ideas. The first is just our history of innovation in this community. You go back 100 years to irrigation technology and then to the city voting to buy our own electric utility in 1937. That's what's allowed us to do a lot of things related to climate change in modern times. Undergrounding our utilities and building a stormwater utility in the 1970s and 80s. Various good government reforms starting in the 2000s with like the budgeting process, dashboards, and all these various things. Like, we're a really innovative community. And one of the reasons why I support these measures is because we're in a really bad place nationally. So we do see the most heightened partisanship and polarization in over 100 years in this country, arguably since the 1860s. Like, that's pretty scary because we all know what happened in the 1860s. We had a civil war. There was violence. There was violent conflict. And that's one of the things that political scientists track is how people feel about violence, whether they're politically accepting of violence. And more Americans right now are, there's something like 15 million Americans that would throw down arms right now. There's many Americans who believe that our political systems are so broken that violence is the only answer right now. And so
Americans are
350 million.
right. And you just said there's 15 million.
15 or 40. Yeah, it's pretty terrifying. That's a
Yeah, but that's not a huge percentage.
It's enough to make a big problem.
But
I know you're saying there's still hope for us.
Let me finish what I'm saying, because basically what the data shows us is that acceptance of political violence is at all-time highs. Remember that.
Yeah.
If that statistic is more palatable. In general, one of the things that I think will get us away from this polarization is more ideas. One of the best ways to have more ideas is more parties. The current systems are put in place in a way which essentially prevents third parties from competing. We didn't go into the details about that when Steve was talking, but if you look at what happens when third party candidates jump in, it's generally what we call the spoiler effect. You have 3 candidates, 2 are in somewhat alignment, 1 is a little different. Let's use some actual examples. 2000 election, you have Ralph Nader and Al Gore, kind of similar candidates. George Bush, Ralph Nader gets a certain percentage of Florida, it flips the election. That's the spoiler effect. The other great example is Ross Perot, actually, on the other side of the aisle in 1992, I believe. Perot and George H.W. Bush essentially were pulling from the same demographic of folks, which allowed Bill Clinton to win the presidency. Bill Clinton was a spoiler because of the third party, just like in some ways George H.W. Bush was in 2000 because of the third party candidate, but in a different way. And so my sense is that we need more third party candidates. They need to have efficacy. They need to be able to compete on even grounds and not create this spoiler effect. That's the only way we're going to have more and more ideas. And thus we have to look at our election systems. And so ranked choice voting, I think, is one way that we can get there. Related to the elections in November and April, we know that the highest turnout you're going to get is presidential elections. So if the city council really, if their goal was highest turnout, they would have actually made this ballot measure about even numbered years. They didn't. And we actually have this incredible thing that's happening in the Front Range right now. Boulder's about to switch their elections to even number years. So Boulder's going to switch their city council elections to presidentials, and we're about to switch our elections to potentially odd number years passes. That's a case study right there. We're going to be able to compare and contrast. In general, with those odd number November elections, we can still anticipate roughly 5 to 10 to 15% of additional turnout because it's a November election. It might even be higher. What I think would be really interesting is if in future reforms, let's say Larimer County decides instead of being a statutory county, that they want to be home rule. They want to have a home rule charter. We can get into what that is if you have questions about that. If Larimer County were to go that route and switch their elections to odd number years, which they could if they were home rule, we could have federal and state elections on odd number or even number years, excuse me. Then the next year would be city, county, school board, and that would repeat over and over and over again. My sense is that we have major ballot fatigue and election fatigue in the United States, and having a more simplified cadence, like which that would allow for, might be a really good way to not diminish the local control issues, because a lot of people are worried, like, you put the local election on federal holiday or a federal election, people are just going to forget about it. People are just they're going to roll off. So I think that that's another potential innovative reform that we could consider, which would allow us to meet multiple goals simultaneously. I just want to thank you all for coming today. I'm excited for the quick Q&A we're about to do. And thank you to the panelists. I just think that this is a really important topic and we need to have more conversations like this and more places to have conversations like this. And so thank you again for joining us. Christian, want to take it away with Q&A?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have we have enough time for a few questions. Any burning questions in the audience? Yeah.
Not a question, but on the follow-up. The ranked choice voting does address a broken part of election. When 70% of the people feel one way in a council district, person that won the 30% doesn't represent those people in that district. That's broken. And so your statement that ranked choice voting is a solution searching for a problem is false.
You're certainly welcome to that meeting.
I see.
Yeah, let's go student voice.
Yeah, I agree. As an 18-year-old, I can say for sure that the complexity that ranked choice voting might add to the system is not impactful at all if you want to, or in terms of decreasing the voter population, because I can say from experience that not wanting to vote for anybody will decrease the turnout way more than just, I don't know what I'm trying to say here.
Having more choices will get more people.
Like you're not throwing away your vote by voting for who you want to vote will always increase the voter turnout. I think that's clear.
Well, and just a message to you as an 18-year-old is please encourage your friends to register in Fort Collins because, you know, unfortunately, a lot of candidates spend very little time reaching out to young voters because your cohort shows up in very low numbers. And some of that is they're still registered in their hometown or they haven't registered here, but register to vote and get people to register to vote because that will make candidates actually reach out to the 18 to 25-year-old group. And you guys are the ones who are going to be inheriting everything that is decided by the elected official. So get your friends to register.
And I'll supplement Melanie's statement by saying, not only get your friends to register,
Also,
but then vote. We've talked about a lot of statistics and I would love to do a deep dive on whether or not we're comparing apples to apples or apples to oranges or to pineapples. So at the end of the day, don't just register.
also vote. Yes.
Vote.
And that we can all agree on. So,
Yes.
yeah, question back here.
There's a lot of hype around the ranked choice voting. What about primary reform, like reforms for primaries?
So
Please.
I'll share the observation that I'm really proud of the state of Colorado and the fact that they are taking a swipe at primary reform. And of course, we've saw our first round of primaries with the reform where if you were not an affiliated voter, so you haven't registered with a single party, you received ballots for both primaries and had the opportunity to make a choice to vote on one side or the other.
So if you're a Republican or a Democrat, you have to vote in that ballot.
That is
You're
correct.
affiliated, you get both, and you
get
get to
both.
pick one. in Colorado.
Yeah, and I think, my observation would be that first effort, which we just saw this year, brought a more moderate final candidate to the general election ballot. It'll be interesting to see how that shakes out, and we're certainly very much in the experimental phase, I would say, of the execution of that concept. But considering that unaffiliated voters are our largest voting bloc in the state of Colorado, it was a smart move, and I'm excited to see if it does help bring more civility and options to the table for people to vote.
Yeah, the thing I was gonna add is that there are a number, so since elections in the Constitution are essentially delegated to the states and then implemented by the cities and the counties, there's a lot of opportunity for reform at the state level with primaries. And a number of states have implemented some form of ranked choice voting as their primary. The example I was going to give, though, is actually what Steve has right here. Alaska has a new election system, which is really interesting because unlike other forms of unlike other election systems, and I talked about earlier, where you can see really clear generational divides as well as partisan divides, the system in Alaska actually has lower partisan divides. And what that essentially means is more libertarians and conservatives support it. And so the Alaska system is what they call a jungle primary. Everyone in one primary together. And then whoever, I think it's the top 4 in Alaska, and it's 5, it's going to be in Nevada. And 3 in California. So the top 5 who come out of that, or excuse me, the top 4 in Alaska, then go to a ranked choice voting general election. So that could be 3 Democrats and a Republican. It could be 3 Republican. It's whoever comes out of that huge jungle primary. People are actually looking at it as an innovative system, an interesting system, and people are watching Alaska really closely right now because of the potential to potentially use a similar system elsewhere. I think I see another question there. No, okay.
Yeah, California also has.
I was gonna say California.
They have a
And
jump,
so you could end up with 2 Democrats on the ballot.
which happens occasionally.
It's also sometimes called an open.
Yes.
Hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you, guys.
Question up front, then we'll go to Robbie.
So I may be totally overthinking this, and I very much admit I don't know a whole lot yet about ranked choice voting. My concern is, and I wonder what your take is on this, does that system, and I should preface that by saying I despise the 2-party system, and I have since the day I could vote. I feel it is so divisive, and so obviously we have to come up with something else. And I don't know whether I just haven't paid much attention in the past, but the manipulation that is now out there with different candidates, is RCV more open to manipulation? Will that throw off Democrats throwing in a lot of money to bring up a horrible Republican candidate, or Republicans putting in a lot of money to bring in? Because it seems the numbers are so significant, and I just wanted your take on that. Is it more open to that type of manipulation? Are we just begging the public to play nice? Is that the only way the system will work, or not necessarily?
So I want to start with, as a reminder, municipal elections are non-partisan.
Right.
Here in Fort Collins.
So,
Here in
Yeah.
Fort Collins.
so I heard you made the statement that if you have 3 candidates that could potentially win,
Right, I really
then
saying
your
that.
negative campaign ads are not as effective.
And it does force you, with ranked choice voting, I think it would make it significantly less partisan, because I can tell you right now, having run as an undercover Democrat, I guess, because I'm registered as a Democrat and I was running in nonpartisan, but where I got my list of people to target was through the Democratic Voter Action Network. And it's very targeted because that's who's going to vote for you. Whereas with ranked choice voting, it doesn't behoove you to keep such a small contact list. You do want to be talking to people who are unaffiliated, Republican, Libertarian, whatever. So I don't know that would speak to whether or not it could be manipulated, because like Ann talked about, there's a lot of outside money coming into
Right.
politics, even at the city level. But it does force candidates to talk to a wider swath of potential voters. So I think it makes it less partisan.
Awesome.
And I know you admit that.
Yes, I'm sorry.
I think we don't know. As Sam shared, 50 communities have made the choice to enable this kind of legislation, with an even smaller percentage of those actually running the system for enough years to have true data. And again, we in Fort Collins like to think that we're very different, and we are very different. So I think that's a wild card question, and I think it's a smart one for you to ask. I don't know that any of us sitting here has a definitive
Sure.
yes or no.
I think we have time for one more question, one or two. Roddy, do you and I know you've had your.
Yeah, I just have a quick question for Ann. As the spokesperson for the Chamber of Commerce, so you're speaking for the businesses in the area. Why specifically would businesses be hurt by ranked choice voting?
It's about good governance, and at the end of the day, we want to make sure that government is funded appropriately in order to serve the citizens. We're not certain that there's a broken system that needs to be fixed, so
There's not something specific that this will hurt businesses' revenue or hurt businesses' profit
no,
margin?
it really is, are we providing an environment for business and government to coexist? And really, this reaction is, we don't see that there's anything broken in that relationship that needs to be fixed.
One last question, one we'll settle between these two.
I have a little spiel, so yes.
Go ahead.
So, sorry for my interruptions. I was an unaffiliated candidate for state representative in our district. Saw Steve a lot. Getting on the ballot by a petition, my threshold was 1,000. I got 823 verified signatures. It was hundreds and hundreds of hours. My parents, my sisters, my cousins, and my friends, we spent hundreds of hours going door to door. Farmers markets, where else did we go, Steve?
Yeah, the farmers market was the big one, which Robbie told me about that.
The paid petition gatherers that Steve was able to hire turned me down. They were not taking, I didn't have very much money anyway. But it was incredibly difficult. You talk about city council being nonpartisan, not true. It's ostensibly nonpartisan, but everyone has an affiliation, and that's how they get on council. Our mayor was like the strongest Democrat in the legislature. She ran most bills as a Democrat. That's why she's mayor. That's why she'll cruise to re-election next year. So what my candidacy, and I think what Steve gets at, and my question would have been, what about no party? So when I went door to door, I talked to like 2,000 people this summer. And I said, well, no, I'm not, I've been unaffiliated since I registered at Hooter High School.
Nice job.
Rocky's our rival. I've been unaffiliated for 20 years. I've grown up in Fort Collins. I've spent, most of my life here. And I don't subscribe to either of these ideologies. People are like, oh, cool, where do I sign? Just like Steve was saying. I think because Fort Collins is 48% unaffiliated by registration. Colorado is 45% unaffiliated by registration. People don't want parties necessarily. People don't want these labels, because as soon as you say liberal, progressive, Democrat, Republican, conservative, people go into their system one brain. Automatic response. Someone on the street asks you for some change. Nope, sorry. Someone says, I'd like $1.23. So like, whoa, wait a second. Why do you need a specific amount of money? There's kind of this, like, we have our blinders on, especially now because things are so divided. So that was what my candidacy, I think what Steve was into. And I think that should be a part of this conversation as well. Rather than try and enable these parties that have had power since the beginning of our country. And it was because Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson did not get along in the same cabinet. So they started their own papers. Like these parties grew out of two guys not being able to get along. 250 years
And it's
ago.
still that way.
Yeah.
It's still that way, right?
And I'm not gonna argue with you about, the influence of the definite Republicans. That's absolutely there. I can tell you, I have been affiliated for 24 years since I, graduated. But what I can tell you is city council issues are nonpartisan. There is not a Democratic position on your fire pit. There is not a Democratic position on traffic.
Disagree with that.
I guess what I'm saying is the issues making their way. The issues though typically are things that you need to think way outside of your party platform. So I agree with you, but I also feel like, folks' values lead in municipal government.
So Melanie, in
Disagree
defense
on
of,
the fire pit.
in defense of Ann, right, the business community is concerned that the city government is going to take too much power. Right, that's one of the
That's his
main.
language, not mine.
This is right. I mean, you want to pay, you want to give all this money to the city council, people on city council, so that they can spend more time to think of more rules and regulations for the businesses and the people. And The businesses are going, no, we're doing fine. I don't need to be regulated anymore. Most of the businesses are trying to be very environmentally friendly. Why do they need someone else telling them how to manage their business? And so this is a very fundamental dichotomy between the political parties today, that one wants less government control, the other one wants more government control, right? So
let me jump in really quickly too. I would say that it's what you're describing is sort of traditional sort of
Yes.
political delineations between liberal and conservative.
and things
And then
change.
Democrat and Republican actually don't capture that right now. If you look at, you know, both parties, for example, over the last 50 years, both parties have raised the size of government. This isn't one party versus the other. It's actually the powers that be in general
And
versus
the types of control they want are different. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And these all feel like great Ram Scalar conversations.
they do.
But policy making is a piece of city council, but a large proportion of it is you responding to constituent concerns about how their neighborhoods are functioning. And I would say I spent, and I was on city council for a hot minute, so please don't take this as doctrine, but a lot of what I did was talk to people about what their concerns were with traffic lights in their neighborhood, people driving too quickly, their fire pit, their concerns about water. So I don't want to
That's good.
overemphasize the
That's
policy
good.
making, because that, yes, that's a piece of it, but an enormous portion of it is understanding what's going on in your neighborhood and advocating for the people who live therein.
In my 4 years with the city, what I would say is that the actual performance of being a city council member is incredibly nonpartisan because of the nature of the work itself. Getting to a position of power, to be getting on city council, you have to lean on the traditional power structures, and those power structures are canvassers for the Republican Party, canvassers for the Democratic Party, et cetera, et cetera. And so having nonpartisan elections was one of those big, and petitioning onto the ballot were those good government reforms 100 years ago. And that was about eliminating party power. It was, oh, we don't want the parties just deciding who's on the ballot. Let's let people petition on. Let's do. So these conversations go way, way, way back, and they connect way, way back. Yeah.
Yeah, that's.
And yes, it's 25 signatures to get on the city of Fort Collins.
Yeah, that's the difference. Yeah, they just hit the threshold, so it used to be 750. To get onto the ballot for state senate, which is with all of Fort Collins, my district is just half of Fort Collins, is also 1,000 signatures. So I had to get 1,000 signatures in half a geographical area as the Senate seat. And also to get onto the ballot for the Democrats, any major political party, like Steve was describing the process, you just go to you just say, hey, I'm a candidate, these are my qualifications, people vote for you, and that's it. As compared to like the enormous expense and time and energy they have to do it without party. And why do we endow these parties and have pretty bad track?
But I think there is still, even though I'm a third party and pretty tiny at this point, I think parties are still very important. People will eventually, even if you tried to outlaw it and change the primary system, parties will still exist. People of like mind will still gather and try to put things together and support the other candidates that they support. So I think parties still serve a proper purpose. Now, maybe the caucus and assembly process is not what we want, and a change to the primary system might do us a lot of good. But ranked choice voting might also be sufficient to solve this problem and enable other third parties to grow and get more prominence.
Yeah, and the reform movement, and really what they say, many folks in the reform movement is, we need more parties, we need more ideas. Our systems are preventing us from getting there. If we change the systems, it potentially will impact polarization, partisanship, and the rest. Just another academic term to throw out there, because Drew reminded me of it in one of the things that you said a little while ago. If you're not familiar with the term, oh my God, it just flew out of my mind. Negative partisanship. So negative partisanship essentially means that the thing that motivates us the most right now is not what we believe in. It's that we are convinced that the people on the other side of the aisle are dead. And that is what motivates us in the two-party system right now more than anything. And we see that
on the other side.
And we see that at the local level too, more and more and more. because we're increasingly aware of sort of the dimensions of local politics. And so that's where future proofing our electoral systems for what comes next might be just as important as looking back and trying to figure out what went right and what went wrong.
So I want
I
to
think we're out of
give,
time.
yeah, I want to give the audience the opportunity as we're networking on our way out to chat with these panelists. So I know there are lingering questions, but in the interest of time, we're going to go and wrap up. And I'd encourage you to come speak to the panelists if you all have time to stay for a few minutes. Grateful for you all. Yeah, can we give them a round of applause? And keep an eye out for the Straayer Center and upcoming events. I know there are many. And if you have any additional questions or feedback, please let us know. And thanks for being here. And thank you for being informed. And thank you to our virtual viewers as well. And to Elise for making it.